Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
We have to recognize the privatizing tendency that exists in the culture as a whole. Our youth are certainly not immune from that. This whole tendency touches them in a time when they are in so much danger of turning in on themselves. Or one of the great problems of adolescence is that they don't see anything wider or bigger, that the whole world appears very narrow and they are zeroed in on their own problems and guilt and limitations.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Sister Joyce Lehman, Director of Religious Education at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of youth ministry and political concerns. Here's Father Bacik.
Joyce, over the years, you and I have had a number of serious conversations. I've always found them enjoyable. I always enjoy your insights. And when you're critical, you always do it with a smile. And that's what's always impressed me. You have been a great consciousness raiser for me, and especially in the area of sexism. And I notice all the times when I would talk and I would say man instead of person and throw in this other kind of sexist language, you would always very gently and with a smile throw in the word that might be less offensive. So you have been a consciousness raiser for me.
And it's worked. It's worked.
Yes, I'm improved on it. People who listen to this radio program regularly can probably tell your influence, where over the years I've become more conscious of trying to be careful of language that way. And it really, is a service that you have performed for me, but it also represents something that probably we all have to do to try to help people raise consciousness about important questions, because it is easy for us to just get bogged down in the ordinary cultural and societal way of looking at things and never rise above that. How are we going to grow and develop unless someone challenges us that way? And years ago, people would go to church, for example, and sing songs like that would have, we are all brothers in Christ, and have no feeling for the fact that women might be left out of that. I don't think women themselves sense that at all. And so we need that kind of work to help us be aware of the problems that exist in our society, the way individual groups could be oppressed, for example. I'd like to turn this in the direction of youth ministry and the whole area of social justice, or the political kind of realm. And I think as we begin to talk about that, we have to recognize the privatizing tendency that exists in the culture as a whole. We've talked about the 70s as the me decade, and the interest in personal growth. So much of the popular books and so on focus in on how am I going to make it, pull my own strings and learn to develop my own talents and find my own fulfillment and happiness. That's constantly bombarded. We get that bombardment all the time in the culture. We hear it in the television and the radio and the talk shows, and the successful people talk that way. And so I think that it's important to recognize that gives us a whole privatizing tendency in the culture, and our youth are certainly not immune from that. This whole tendency touches them in a time when they are in so much danger of turning in on themselves. Or one of the great problems of adolescence is that they don't see anything wider or bigger, that the whole world appears very narrow and they are zeroed in on their own problems and guilt and limitations. So maybe that's the background with which we can approach this question of youth and trying to educate them to social justice concerns.
And I think one of the things to be conscious of, as you pointed out in your example at the beginning of the program, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a longer period of time, and it takes almost a constant kind of reminder to keep our consciousnesses raised. And I think as adults, that responsibility, again, in dealing with youth, lies with us initially. Where are we at in light of issues of peace and justice in the world?
I suppose one of the problems with that, when we begin talking that way, is the overwhelming complexity of these problems. And as one of my young people in class once told me when we were talking about social justice matters, we were asking why the people who are not involved in the movements anymore, the movements for peace and social justice to tackle racism and so on. He says, "Hey, Father, you don't understand, man, that tears me up. Tears up my guts." In other words, it was too much to take. And I think we have to ask that question about young people today and the political process. I mean, if we are trying to educate them to the concerns of the larger world, are they really psychically or emotionally ready to deal with that? I think of a past experience. The details are probably not clear to me now, but the generalities are, and that is we adopted a program at the high school level to get young people involved in trying to help poor people. And I think there was a lot of subtle pressure and manipulation to say to them, boy, you better do this or you're not a good person. You know, we put a heavy guilt trip upon them that you better be involved in this social justice outreach here. And what we found much later was a great resentment about that the young people felt very put upon, that they felt that they had been manipulated and controlled into being concerned about these poor people when their real, natural, dominant concern was with themselves, with their own development and growth, their own friendships, their own struggles with authority, their own problems with sexuality. That's where their dominant, natural interest was, and they felt coerced, pushed, brainwashed into this larger concern. Now, I'm not saying that that means we got to drop any effort to help them to understand the political, social dimension of life, but it seems to me it represents a caution, something we ought to look at right at the beginning here. Do you want to react to that at all?
As you were speaking, I was thinking there are a couple of elements in that that are necessary for something like an outreach program done by youth to be successful. The one is you know, you point out the guilt trip, that if they didn't do it, they weren't a good person. That's not taking into account their whole lives, because there, as you said, there are other things that are important for them at the time. But I think it's a gentle invitation to call them out of themselves, to say, okay, you know, look at yourself, be in touch with your problems, be in touch with your search, but you know, take this into account in the much larger picture. Step outside yourself and put yourself in another person's place. I think it's a really important aspect of overcoming that privatizing tendency in adolescence. We meet adults in their 40s and 50s who have not been able to step into another person's shoes. They don't know how to feel with another person. And I think that's an important part of justice, is we cannot recognize oppression elsewhere unless we've recognized it in ourselves. Once we've been in touch with it in ourselves, we can take the step out, and then comes the compassion. Then comes the drive to reach out, to heal, to touch. And I think we have to help and support our young people in getting in touch with what's happening inside themselves, and then that stepping out, and then the calling to heal and to walk with.
Yeah, I like a number of points that you said there. The one was the invitation idea. It seems to me if we're going to have programs for young people, it has to have a great deal of freedom involved in it. That if we're going to say we're going to have this program to go help paint houses in the ghetto or visit the nursing home, that it has to be very free. That people, they have to feel within themselves that they had a choice about it, that they could say no or they could choose other alternatives. And that seems to me to be vital, and I would like to put a lot of stress on that for our high schools that have such programs. Not to get rid of them because the students might feel put upon, but to have them in place, but to make sure they're very free. And you use the word invitation, to always be inviting them to a larger involvement in the world. So that's one thing to strike. Yeah, go ahead.
You also use the word variety and alternatives, and I think that is crucial too. Part of that is what we want people to do is get in touch with their own giftedness, and we're not all gifted in the same areas. I find it difficult to work with the elderly, but my gift is in another area, and I have to find my gifts and develop them. Not that I never do the other to keep in touch with the development of perhaps a potential gift, but I think the same thing is true again of our youth. We recognize and respect their individual giftedness, and then we call that forth and allow them, give them an opportunity to develop the gift and support them in determining what is their giftedness.
It seems like that's one of the developments in the whole area of youth ministry these days. At one time, I guess we thought of youth ministry as just teaching students something in a classroom, or of having opportunities for them to have their social events and recreational events. But now, in the literature, I see a lot of stress upon allowing the young people to contribute, to using their gifts, as you said, for the well-being of the larger community, of giving them something to do. I guess I've seen that at times in programs where the high school students will like it when they're asked to help out the junior high students in some way, to put on something for them or to encourage them in some way. It seems like they feel good because they have contributed something now to the larger community. And I think that would be an important part to stress in this, a way in which we're going to help youth break out of their egocentricity, the centering in on just on oneself, that we've got to show them a bigger world here. So there's programs that can help us do that.
I think that's why we've moved from the idea of adolescent catechesis to the concept of youth ministry, because ministry at its best generates ministry. So if we truly are ministering to youth, then eventually that ministry will also be by youth.
And they'll get that a lot by example, because they will see the adult community interested in service, interested in doing, and that will help. Surely one of the things that parishes have to do is to have a good social justice program. They have to have a committee that will keep in front of them the great social questions of peace and war and racism and hunger and the prison problems and all of those things, so that in general in the life of the parish that is brought out. Surely it will help if young people in the parish hear sermons on social justice matter periodically, that if there are many opportunities given to get involved in the political process and to try to make a difference in the parish as a whole. Surely that will come across to the young people that Christianity itself is not a turned-in-groupy kind of thing, but that it's got to do with service, that Jesus called us to help spread the kingdom, that the law of love says we're supposed to help those who are in need, that we believe in a God who gave political and economic and social freedom to his people and calls upon us to do the same thing. All those themes that are in the Scriptures, the social dimension of the gospel, has to be part of the lived experience of the community. And I think if young people see that, they will be helped at least they get some perception that religion is not just a private matter.
It also is religion should be the freeing. You spoke of the young man before who felt torn up, and I think if you watch the evening news, you can almost be paralyzed to think, what can one individual do in the face of this world mess that we seem to have gotten ourselves into? And I think what the gospel says to us is that I as an individual can make a difference, but I am an individual within a larger community, a community that believes in the dignity of the human person wherever that person is. And so the gospel then calls us, encourages us, and supports us to reach out, so that justice becomes something that we do in our daily lives, in right relationships with others, and then the development of that in terms of our own consciousness raising about global problems, and believe we can do something.
There's that statement of the 1971 Synod of Catholic Bishops meeting in Rome that is often quoted, and we have to say it over and over. I think that work on behalf of social justice is a constitutive element in the preaching of the gospel. It's an essential element of what it's all about. Unfortunately, we have many religious people who don't see that yet, who still think that religion is just a matter of saying one's own prayers, that it's all of a private kind of piety. And so we're fighting a larger cultural problem here that wants to restrict religion to the church, or Christianity to 1 hour a week, or simply to the prayer life. And so we first of all have to break through that and see that indeed there is a social dimension to the gospel. And that is taking a long time to do, and there's many people actively resisting that. There's many people who think that that is strictly false. But on any open reading of the Gospels, it seems to me that social dimension emerges so many different places, it's really hard to ignore it. And we ignore it, I think, at our own peril. What was Jesus said at the parable of the Last Judgment is that the criteria for getting into heaven in Matthew 25 is whether one has helped those in need or not, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the imprisoned, has one helped them or not? Not did I say my prayers, or not did I go to church or not, but did I help those people? So I think that's well for all of us to keep in mind as to what the Christianity is all about.
It's an interesting thing. I think with younger children there's a natural generosity and sharing, and I think the time of adolescence tends that drawing in aspect that we've talked about before. But I think that if we can continue to tap and keep in touch with that generosity that has been there, we find that youth are often eager to do something for others. And
is that really true?
I think so. I think so. I think that's where you can get an enthusiasm. I've spoken before of this ecumenical youth group we worked with. They did a lot along not only the social line and educational line, but a service line. They operated a drop-in second-hand clothing store that they always had coffee and donuts available. Adults ran it, but the youth kept it going, like taking care of the physical place, as well as going down and dropping in themselves simply to be with some of the people who were less fortunate, and to be in touch with some of that. They did it on their own time and their own initiative. They were supported by adults, which again I think is very important. They need to see it happening among the older adult population.
What's interesting, that program that we often called the Guadalupe program at Bowling Green was something that was sustained over all the years I was there without any real involvement of the staff. I don't even know how it got started, but there was a group of students who went into the inner city of Toledo on Saturdays and spent a number of hours with the young people, just playing basketball with them or showing them crafts or taking them ice skating someplace else or to the zoo and so on. And that program sustained itself over all those years without anybody telling them what to do or electing officers or picking the people for the next year or doing anything really, except providing transportation at times and storing the equipment they needed and all of that. And I found that really fascinating, that there would every year a new leader would emerge, take it over without any vote or anyone telling them what to do. And I think that speaks to the point you were making, that there's at least some youth around who are interested in reaching out and doing the whole social justice thing.
I think on the college level, too, with talking with people from some of the other campus ministry centers, their volunteer programs usually get a large turnout. And recognizing sometimes the difficulty that the collegian has with commitment over a longer period of time, but still there is a desire to do something for others. And I think that needs to be encouraged, and it needs to be, given the praise that's due it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we need to celebrate that kind of thing. There was another point, Joyce, that you made that struck me as well, is that is something about being in touch with what is within us in terms of this social justice idea. Let's take the whole question of peace and war, which is something very much on our minds these days because of the threat of the nuclear holocaust and the whole ground zero business and the way in which it looks to me as though the peace movement is taking off or growing, and the great opportunity we have. That one author said that every time that he talked to young people about the question of violence as a means of solving problems, he found a response. In other words, in our culture, we've got the idea that you really solve problems through violence. I mean, so many of our TV shows end up with somebody getting shot, or it's the strong, macho person who solves the situation. Very seldom, really, are problems solved through dialogue, through rational conflict resolution. That's not the normal way of doing it. It's because someone has acted violently that we have seen solutions. And he says that very often young people can see that tendency within their own selves when it's brought out, that there is this idea that it just predisposed that way. We've got the Old West, the six gun, the cowboy movies, the war history that we've had, the macho image. All of those things say this is the way you do it. You naturally think in these terms. So we have military academies, but we don't have a peace academy. It's a very different kind of thing here. So that maybe one of the things we need to do is recognize the tendency to violence within our own selves, the tendency to solve problems through power and control, and maybe we need to talk a lot more about conflict resolution, of dialogue as a tool for solving problems, of civil discourse as the way we move forward politically in this country. That's one of the terrible things about the extremists and the terrorism in our world. It's all irrational. It gets away from the notion that we are creatures of intelligence and that we have the great tool of discussion to move forward towards consensus so we can live in peace and harmony.
I think that bringing that whole sense of the peace war issue right down into the home again with youth, we're not good in helping them in conflict resolution in problems in the family with their parents or one or the other parent or with their brothers and sisters. Just generally, I think we find that we either, the old flight or fight routine, we either withdraw and hole ourselves up someplace in silence, or we fight it out, and not always physical abuse, but verbal abuse as well, so that the violent tendencies, we see them happening in simple, table conversation or coming home late at night and mom is waiting up, and the whole type of dialogue that happens at that point when there's a conflict or a crisis.
Or lack of dialogue, perhaps.
Yes, yes, true.
Where it just becomes argumentative and so on. Yeah, I think that we really could do a lot of work with youth this way. One author has talked about having weekends that would be devoted to social justice matters, maybe a whole weekend on peace and war, in which perhaps a movie could be shown about the threat of nuclear holocaust, and where people could begin to discuss that, and where the Christian dimension of the gospel, the social dimension of the gospel would be brought out of the need to be a peacemaker in our world, and where people could talk about the violent tendencies in their own heart. In other words, you could imagine youth going away for that kind of weekend as opposed to the usual things we do where we go away to pray for a weekend just privately, or where we talk about relationships or sexuality, things that are easy to talk about. In other words, if you ask me to give a talk to young people, I know that if I talk about human relationships and sexuality, I got immediate interest. And it's sort of easy to do in a way, and it's where their own head is and their heart is. But we need to challenge that. It seems like somebody around has got to say, hey, there's more to it than that. We've got these problems of hunger. What are we going to do about those? And you really do get turned off often by that, precisely because people's minds are on their own problems. And yet I don't think we can give in to that. The adult generation, parents, religious leaders, teachers, and so on, we have to hammer away, even though it often makes us feel frustrated. And even though we don't get the response, and more people fall asleep when we talk about that, and more people attack us afterwards after we talk about it, it's really easy. There's a subtle temptation there to withdraw from that and say, well, I'll talk about sexuality instead of racism. And I think we must fight that tendency.
I think that the attack that comes back very often is a good opportunity to practice the very thing we're talking about in terms of conflict resolution. how we either let it go by us, admitting that it's there, or how we come back with the violence ourselves, attack with attack. I think with young people, too, it's good to give them an experience of what it is we want their consciousnesses raised about, like a hunger weekend. I know of one place that had what they called a lock-in, and the young people went for 24 hours without food or sleep. And they kept a variety of educational activities as well as physical and social activities. But the youngsters came out with a strong sense of consciousness about those who have less than they do. And I think in some instances it helped them recognize how much they ate or how much they wasted in their eating. And I think it was just a small example of something that they could do, just in terms of waste for themselves. But they had a sense of the larger picture through that.
It seems like it's the action and involvement that's often needed, isn't it? I mean, you can talk about these things, but it lacks any bite. I mean, if the young people go to a nursing home and see the older people and interact with them and talk with them and strike up a warm personal relationship with one person, they probably get much more of a feeling for the problem of the aging in the aged in the United States than by all the articles they would read or the little sermons we would give them and so on, because it would become very real to them then. Or to visit a prison and see the situation that actually exists there, or to talk to prisoners. I think that would be much better in terms of trying to raise people's consciousness. Well, Joyce, we've been talking here a lot about the political side. I'm thinking of the young people. We got to work at them being good citizens, don't we? I mean, that whole sense of the common weal, the goodness of the good of the whole community. We have to try to instill that sense again, that we're citizens of this country. If this country's going to run right, we have to be people who are involved in it. And the whole idea of getting people to think in terms of voting, isn't it a scandal, I think, in a way that, in my own remembrance, is that the young people didn't vote in any higher numbers when they were allowed to vote at age 18 than the population as a whole. I think there was sort of a misconception on that they would really vote and be politically involved in that. And I know on the campus we've seen a terrible struggle to just get that kind of involvement. And so something is lacking along the way here in terms of responsibility for the country as a whole, another political dimension that really we would need to develop.
I think all of us, including the young, need to realize we can make a difference.
Maybe that's one of the key things to be said here, that when we feel the sense that, we could be torn up by the problem and that it's too much, it's too complex, we've got to get back to our Christian understanding of things that says, no, I must make the effort anyway, because that's right and proper. I have a responsibility to the larger community. I'm going to do it, try to be a peacemaker, try to create better racial harmony in our world, try to help the people who are hungry no matter what, even if I don't see the results. On the other hand, often when we get started, we do see little things happen, just when we're involved. And then when we can get ourselves into a larger community, into a church and so on, and then maybe we can make a greater impact. So I think you're right. We have to be able to see inside of us that indeed we could do our little bit, and in fact we must do our little bit. Maybe that's the way we get people more politically aware.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Sister Joyce Lehman, Director of Religious Education at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. The topic of this week's Reflections was youth ministry and political concerns. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.